Today in Harvard Square, we're visiting a site associated with Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs was born in Edenton, North Carolina, likely in 1813. Her grandmother, Molly Horniblow, had been freed upon her former slaveholder's death, but Harriet and her mother Delilah remained enslaved. In 1825, her brother was sold to Dr. James Norcom. Harriet was willed to Norcom's daughter. For the next few years, she watched as Norcom fathered many mixed-race children with the enslaved women in his household, later to sell them when his wife became enraged with jealousy. When Harriet came of age, Norcom declared he would build a cabin and keep her in it for himself. And she knew she could not hold him off forever. A white lawyer named Samuel Sawyer openly expressed his pity for her, and his kindness developed into a relationship. Later, Jacobs would write, "I knew nothing would enrage Dr. Norcom so much as to know that I favored another, and it was something to triumph over my tyrant, even in that small way. I knew that as soon as a new fancy took him, his victims were sold far off to get rid of them, especially if they had children. I had seen several women sold with his babies at the breast. He never allowed his offspring by slaves to remain long inside of himself and his wife. Of a man who was not my master, I could ask to have my children well supported, and in this case, I felt confident that I should obtain the boon. I also felt quite sure that they would be made free. With all these thoughts revolving in my mind and seeing no other way of escaping the doom I so much dreaded, I made a headlong plunge." She became pregnant twice, giving birth to a son, Joseph, and a daughter, Louisa Matilda, who, although Sawyer's children, were both now property of Norcom, according to the law. It was illegal in North Carolina for enslaved women to say who the father of their child was. Norcom, in his jealous rage, taunted her daily with the prospect of selling her children if she did not submit to him. Faced with this daily threat, she resolved to escape. First taking refuge in a swamp outside of Edenton, she would soon sequester herself in an attic's crawl space at her free grandmother Molly's house. The space was 8 feet by 7 feet and only 3 feet tall. She lived here for 7 years, silently watching as her children visited their great-grandmother below. The effects of not being able to stand or exercise for 7 years would take a drastic toll on her health. Immediately after her escape, Norcom attempted to sell her children as well as brother to the hard life of a plantation out of spite. But the slave trader he chose was secretly enlisted by the children's father, Samuel Sawyer, who bought his children as well as Harriet's brother, John Jacobs. In 1842, Harriet finally escaped her attic cell to board a boat bound for Philadelphia. A year later, she was forced to flee to the relative safety of Boston when Norcom discovered her whereabouts and attempted to recapture her. In Boston, she would finally be reunited with her brother, whom Samuel Sawyer had released from service, and her children, whom he had sent to her. In 1851, the family heard that the slave-holding Norcoms had once again discovered their whereabouts and moved to Rochester, New York. There she befriended women's suffrage activist and abolitionist Amy Post, who earned Harriet's trust. When Harriet finally divulged her secret identity and experiences to her friend, Amy Post encouraged her to write it into a book. Harriet resisted the idea until former First Lady Julia Tyler published an editorial in the New York Times suggesting African Americans enjoyed slavery and preferred it to the difficulties of making their own way in the world. Harriet would later write, "A clergyman who goes to the South for the first time usually has some feeling, however vague, that slavery is wrong. The slaveholder suspects this and plays his game accordingly. He makes himself as agreeable as possible, talks on theology and other kindred topics. The reverend gentleman is asked to invoke a blessing on a table loaded with luxuries. After dinner, he walks around the premises and sees the beautiful groves and flowering vines and the comfortable huts of favored household slaves. Southern invites him to talk with these slaves. He asks them if they want to be free, and they say, "Oh, no, massa." This is sufficient to satisfy him. He comes home to publish a South Side view of slavery and to complain of the exaggerations of abolitionists. He assures people that he has been to the South and seen slavery for himself, that it is a beautiful patriarchal institution, that the slaves don't want their freedom, that they have hallelujah meetings and other religious privileges. What does he know of the half-starved wretches toiling from dawn to dark on the plantations, of mothers shrieking for their children, torn from their arms by slave traders, of young girls dragged down into moral filth, of pools of blood around the whipping post, of hounds trained to tear human flesh, of men screwed into cotton gins to die? Slaveholders showed him none of these things, and the slaves dared not tell of them if he had asked them. Her book, when published, was called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and all names were changed, including her own. This book, published at the onset of the Civil War, 9 years after Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and 16 years after Frederick Douglass' narrative, was shocking and personal, the first widely published account of life as a woman in slavery. As the Civil War progressed, Harriet and her daughter Louisa Matilda traveled to Union-occupied territories of the South. They organized clothing and food drives for formerly enslaved people, found housing for all they could, and even opened 2 schools for people of color, one in Alexandria, Virginia, and another in Savannah, Georgia. As Reconstruction gave way to Jim Crow laws and the violent intimidation of the KKK, they realized there was no safe way to operate these schools and returned north here to Cambridge. On Trowbridge Street, and later on the corner of Mount Auburn and Story Streets, Harriet and her daughter Louisa ran a boarding house for Harvard students and staff till 1877, when they moved to Washington, D.C. Harriet died in Washington in 1897 at the approximate age of 84. Her body was taken home to Cambridge and interred in Mount Auburn Cemetery, where you can visit her today.